G'day and happy holidays! My name's RJ and welcome to Killer Canuck, a recurring segment here on RUE MORGUE TV. 'Tis the season of giving, and some films continue to do exactly that even decades after their release. Some feature iconic characters, some feature iconic shots, but every now and then one rolls around that flips the entire genre on its head. Let's take a falalala-look at 1974's seminal horror masterpiece, Black Christmas.
Now, admittedly, a lot of you watching this video already know a great deal about Bob Clark's Black Christmas. It's arguably one of the most well-known Canadian horror films of all time. But with the holidays coming up, it just didn't feel right to pass over it. So, hopefully not all this information is regifted, and you get to take away something new.
When Bob Clark traveled north to edit Death Dream, he fell in love with Toronto and stayed in Canada for nearly a decade. Black Christmas is Clark's first entirely Canadian film, with Death Dream having been shot in Florida. Quadrant, the production company behind Death Dream, offered Canadian designer-turned-writer RUE MORGUE some money to rewrite a script he had about a babysitter receiving calls from inside the house she was staying in. This idea would of course come back around as When a Stranger Calls in 1979. Moore repenned the script and changed the title to Stop Me. This script eventually made its way to Vision 4, which Bob Clark was a part of. Clark reworked the script personally, adding all of the humor in the film, which included some new characters, such as Margot Kidder's Barb and Marion Waldman's Mrs. Mack. The film was greenlit with a budget of just under $700,000, and shooting began in Toronto in the winter of '73. Black Christmas opens at Pi Kappa Sigma sorority house, where the girls are having a party before everyone leaves for the holiday break. Contrasted with the warm, friendly atmosphere inside, outside in the cold, a faceless presence lurks around, peering through windows. This POV style of footage would become immensely popular after 1978, thanks to the massive success of a little movie called Halloween. But other than Peeping Tom in 1960, this is one of the first instances it's used to place the audience directly in the shoes of the killer. The stalker takes one more peek inside, before scaling the lattice on the side of the sorority and entering through an upstairs window.
Camera operator Burt Dunk had a specialty rig design so he could use both hands while climbing, and for the rest of the film, it's always his hands in the POV shots. The camera was mounted on his shoulder, and the rig was made of 1-inch thick steel with a pad on the front. It was hinged at the shoulders so Dunk could lift the front of it, allowing for these shots looking up at the house.
Inside, the sorority sisters continue their drinking and debauchery, unaware of the present danger. There's Jess, played by Olivia Hussey, well known at the time for playing Juliet in Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 rendition of Romeo and Juliet. Hussey had never done a scary movie and loved the script when she read it. There's Barb, played by a pre-Lois Lane Margot Kidder, Phyllis, played by SCTV's Andrea Martin, previously featured on the channel alongside Eugene Levy in Cannibal Girls, and Claire Harrison, played by Toronto's Lynn Griffin, seen recently on the channel as Patty in Curtains. Claire bids farewell to her boyfriend Chris, played by Canadian horror alumni Art Hindle, seen previously on the channel as Frank Carbeth in David Cronenberg's The Brood. Griffin said that Hindle often reminds her that he was her first on-screen kiss. The phone in the front room rings and the sorority receives a call from someone that they have dubbed the Moaner. The caller, who eventually indirectly introduces himself as Billy, slings a crass menagerie of some of the foulest, most obscene dialogue you've ever heard in a movie while the house listens in.
Let me lick it.
Barb does throw it back at him, but the caller disconnects abruptly with a direct threat.
I'm going to kill you.
Barb gets into an ugly argument with the rest of the girls, and her hurtful words encourage Claire to head upstairs to pack. She heads into her room, accompanied by the house's hilariously named cat, Claude. She hears a noise in her closet and, thinking it to be the cat, heads over to investigate. From the POV of Billy hiding behind a plastic dry cleaning sheet, Claire is bagged, tagged, and left to rock in one of the most iconic shots in horror history. Claude jumps in her lap and licks her face. Griffin notes that the cat, quote, did not take direction very well, so they lined the bag with catnip.
The plastic bag in this scene of course had a hole in the mouth so Griffin could breathe between takes, but that was no sweat for the young actor who could hold her breath for long periods of time because she was a swimmer.
The sorority house mother, Mrs. McHenry, joins the party. Bob Clark originally wanted Betty Davis for this role, but she was unavailable, so Mrs. Mack is instead played expertly by Toronto's Marion Waldman. Waldman was primarily a writer and stage performer, but casting director Karen Hazard knew her because they had offices just down the hall from each other. She had also had a bit part in the Bob Clark-produced Deranged Confessions of a Necrophile that was released the same year. Lynn Griffin recalls that Waldman hung out with the cast even on days she wasn't shooting, because she liked them all so much. Jess receives a call from her boyfriend Peter, played by Keir DeLay, known for playing Dave in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. DeLay took this role mostly because he was excited to work with Olivia Hussey. Peter is rigorously rehearsing for a piano performance and doesn't have much time to chat, so she sets up a serious conversation between them for the following day. The party ends, but not before Mrs. Mack goes on a booze hunt. Bob Clark based this character, including these drunken antics, on his own Aunt Mabel. The next day, Mr. Harrison, Claire's father, played by Ontario's James Edmund, waits in vain outside Soldiers Tower at the University of Toronto to bring his daughter home for the holidays. He's minding his own business in a relaxing long shot before getting belted in the face by a rogue snowball. The guy watching over the hooligans who took the shot apologizes poorly.
Yeah, well, I said I was sorry.
And Mr. Harrison asks if he knows Claire. Conveniently, he's a member of their brother fraternity and directs Claire's father to Pi Kappa Sig. Mr. Harrison meets with Mrs. Mack, who explains that Claire might be at a fundraiser that the sorority is throwing for underprivileged children. In a series of excellent comedic scenes, Mrs. Mack tries to maintain the integrity of the sisters through a bit of grab ass and poorly timed line deliveries.
Oh, God damn it, Claude, you little prick!
The pair then take a cab to the fundraiser. Jess visits with Peter and tells him that she's pregnant. Her pianist partner is excited at the idea, but she tells him that she isn't going to keep the baby and wants to have an abortion. The rest of the conversation does not go over well, with Peter angrily accusing Jess that she didn't even consult him first. He tells her to leave, but calls after her, setting up a further discussion on the matter that night after his recital. Mr. Harrison calls his wife from the fundraiser, letting her know that he's yet to find Claire, but that he's been chatting with her friend Barb, who's going to call around about her. In the background of the split diopter, Barb proves her worth by helping nourish one of the underprivileged kids.
That thing's a little bugger schnockert, son of a bitch.
Back at the sorority, Jess receives another call from Billy.
Billy was played by Nick Mancuso, who delivered many of his lines while standing on his head to compress his thorax and give it that surreal sound. Many other voices, including that of director Bob Clark and composer Carl Zatreras, were added in post, and they used a machine called a harmonizer to put everything slightly out of tune. The voice that Olivia Hussey heard on set was just that of director Bob Clark, and he was far less obscene than the final product.
Barb, Phil, and Mr. Harrison visit the police station to report Claire missing, but have to deal with Sergeant Nash. Nash is played by Vancouver's Doug McGrath, known to Canadians at that time for co-starring in William Fruitt's 1970 classic, Going Down the Road. He would also return for Clark as Coach Warren in 1981's Porky's. McGrath was given the role of Nash without even auditioning. He tells the trio that Claire is likely at a cottage with a boyfriend, but begrudgingly takes down the phone number at the sorority, including its unique new exchange.
Fellatio 20880. It's a new exchange, FE.
Jess visits Chris, Claire's boyfriend, who's having clap bombs taken at him by the boys. Having Chris play Tendy was Art Hindle's idea, and they hired a few of the players from U of T to take some shots at him. She tells him that Claire never made it home, and that the police aren't taking her disappearance seriously. Later that evening, Peter sweatily botches his recital, his mind evidently residing elsewhere. Back at the police station, Lieutenant Ken Fuller files a missing persons report for a young girl named Janice, the daughter of Mrs. Quaife, the film debut of Ottawa's Martha Gibson, who had a blink and you'll miss it cameo in Andy Muschietti's It. Lieutenant Fuller is played by the unmistakable John Saxon, well known to genre fans of course for his performances in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dream Warriors, and New Nightmare. His conversation is interrupted by Chris kicking in the front door.
Nash, you stupid son of a bitch, you got a big goddamn mouth!
Lieutenant Fuller beckons Chris and his incredible fur coat over. This fur coat actually belonged to Art Hindle, and he still owns the damn thing. Chris reminds everyone what country we're in.
Yeah, I've been taking her out.
And Fuller leads him to his office to discuss Claire's disappearance. Disappointed in his performance, Peter takes his frustration out on his tools. When asked about this instrument destruction scene, Bob Clark said, "It was a cheap piano, that's for sure." Back at Pi Kappa Sig, Barb, Phil, Mr. Harrison, and Mrs. Mack wait anxiously for any news. Trying fruitlessly to keep Mr. Harrison's spirits up, Barb rambles on about a species of turtle that can, quote, screw for 3 days, implying that maybe Claire is somewhere doing the same. This whole bit about the turtles and the zebras was invented by Bob Clark and delivered perfectly by Margot Kidder. When Barb gets drunkenly defensive about thinking people blame her for Claire's leaving earlier, Phil bluntly tells Barb that she's drunk and that she should go to bed.
Margot Kidder recalls that Olivia Hussey was stoic and serious most of the time while on the set because of her relatively new stardom from Romeo and Juliet. So, her and fellow comic co-star Andrea Martin spent the majority of their time trying to get her to laugh.
Jess, Chris, and Art Hindle's fur coat arrived to recruit Phil and Mr. Harrison into the ranks of a search party organized by the police to look for Claire and Janice Quaife. This manhunt scene was shot at Grenadier Pond in High Park in Toronto. It features several crew members playing cops, including props master Frenchie Berger on the sled with the balaclava. It was a crisp Canadian winter night with temperatures dropping to -12 degrees Celsius. Bob Clark originally wanted Edmund O'Brien for the role of Lieutenant Fuller, and even went as far as to cast him and fly him to Toronto. However, when Clark met him after he arrived, he was in a wheelchair and experiencing the effects of mid to late stage Alzheimer's disease, so they made the difficult decision to replace him 2 days before the shoot.
Composer Carl Zatreras knew John Saxon and had sent him the script. Saxon loved it, and when called upon, he headed to the airport 2 days later. He stepped off the plane, right into hair, makeup, wardrobe, and straight onto the set at 1:30 in the morning to shoot this search party scene.
Mrs. Mack's taxi arrives while she's getting packed and ready to head to her sister's for the holidays. While sipping her favorite holiday beverage, she hears Claude meowing somewhere in the house. She searches for the cat, who has quite impressively climbed the ladder into the attic. Mrs. Mack pokes her head in searching for Claude and catches a horrifying glimpse of Claire's gift-wrapped body. But before she has time to react, Billy swings a vintage pulley hook her way, catching her under the chin and hoisting her up into the darkness. The cab driver, played by co-producer Jerry R. Bede, shouts into the house to no avail as Billy closes the attic door. Meanwhile, the search party is tragically successful. The body of young Janice Quaife is found. The searchers take a break and Jess returns to the sorority to wait for Peter. There, she receives another phone call from Billy.
I know what you did, Billy! Billy!
Having had enough, Jess phones the police to report the calls. In the midst of the report, she is needlessly jump-scared by Peter. She asks him how the recital went and he responds accordingly. The two sit down and have an in-depth conversation about their future.
You're talking about killing our baby as though you were having a wart removed.
Peter says that he's going to leave the conservatory and that they will be married, but Jess stops him in his tracks.
Peter, I don't want to marry you.
She tells him that she still has hopes and dreams of her own that she still wants to pursue, and that this baby was not a part of her plan.
This conversation is extremely progressive for 1974. This scene single-handedly keeps this movie more modern than many of its peers. None of Bob Clark's female characters feel like fodder and continually drive the plot forward. In fact, it's many of the male characters that come across as ineffective and unhelpful. Chris and Mr. Harrison don't know what to do when Claire is missing. Peter can't keep it together when faced with Jess's firm stance on the baby. And Officer Nash, well, his worthlessness speaks for itself.
At the police station, Lieutenant Fuller lays into Nash about not bringing the obscene phone calls up to him earlier. He tells Mr. Harrison, Chris, and Art Hindle's fur coat that he's going to investigate the sorority. After they leave, he looks to dial the number at the house.
Fellation? Yeah, it's a new exchange. FE.
I love this scene. Nash's ignorance, this guy's infectious laughter, John Saxon's face, fuck, it's too much. Back at the house, Peter leaves Jess with an open threat, just as Phyllis walks in with Lieutenant Fuller. He takes a walk through the house and tells the girls that he's going to bug their phone, asking if there are any other lines. They tell him that Mrs. Mack has one of her own upstairs. A cop is positioned outside, and Fuller explains that they'll have to keep Billy on the line for a certain amount of time to get a proper trace. This is a dance that we've all seen before. The officers leave the house and Phil finally lets her emotions out. She cries on Jess's shoulder, admitting that she thinks that Claire is dead. She apologizes and wipes her eyes before heading up to bed, exhausted.
The role of Phyllis was originally to be played by Gilda Radner, but she was offered SNL a month prior and had to back out. So she was appropriately replaced by fellow sketch comedy alumni Andrea Martin. And it just goes to show you, if it's not one thing, it's another.
A group of carolers stands at the front door and sings "Oh Come Let Us Adore Him," drawing Jess outside to listen. This impromptu musical number gives Billy time to sneak down from the attic and into Barb's bedroom where she's sleeping. Arming himself with a unicorn statue from her glass menagerie, Billy mumbles to himself and his apparent sister Agnes, before violently plunging the horned equine into Barb repeatedly. A technical issue with how the camera was loaded gives this scene a jittery, surreal effect, and the juxtaposition of her murder with the children singing skyrockets Barb's kill to legend status. And it's all done with minimal blood, and without any frames of the weapon actually breaking skin. Jess thanks the children and heads inside to answer the phone. Everyone's least favorite telemarketer screams mostly nonsense into the receiver as Jess and Fuller listen in, but something he says this time around catches her attention.
Just like having a wart removed.
Billy hangs up and Fuller tells Jess that he wasn't on long enough. Phyllis comes downstairs and Jess relays her concerns about the moaner potentially being Peter, but as the two are talking, her boyfriend calls her crying about the baby. Fuller listens in on this conversation and begins looking into Peter as a potential suspect. Phil then heads upstairs to check on Barb, but when she enters the room, the door slams behind her. Jess calls up after her, but the empty halls of the sorority do not answer.
The Pi Kappa Sig sorority house plays like another character throughout the film. You feel its presence. Black Christmas was shot entirely on location, and this house was luckily found on a residential Toronto side street. Bob Clark and co. literally pulled into the driveway and knocked on the front door for an impromptu scout.
Art director Karen Bromley was with Clark on the scout. They painted and wallpapered the majority of the house because they shot in a considerable amount of its rooms. They gave particular care to the characters' bedrooms and decorated them to match their personalities. Phone rings once. Phone rings twice. Phone rings 3 times. It's Billy. He's been meaning to call you. He's been meaning to call you. Then he did. Jess manages to keep him on the line long enough for the phone line operator to trace the call.
This phone line operator, appropriately named Graham, is played by Les Carlson. Carlson would come back for Clark as the pushy tree salesman in A Christmas Story and would later appear in Videodrome, The Dead Zone, and The Fly for David Cronenberg.
Graham relays the address, 6 Belmont Street, to Nash, who in turn relays it to Lieutenant Fuller, who reminds him that that's where the calls are going in.
That's where they're coming from too, sir.
You betcha, the calls are coming from inside the house. Billy has been using Mrs. Mack's separate line. Fuller tries to CB his man on the scene, but his throat has been viciously slashed. He asks Nash to call Jess and tell her to get out of the house. He's on his way. When faced with the devastating news, Jess braces herself to save her sisters upstairs. Against Nash's pleas, she climbs the stairs to Barb's room, arming herself with a fire poker on the way. She helplessly calls out to her friends before opening the door to see Barb and Phil's bloody bodies on the bed. But before she has time to mourn, she spots Billy peering at her from behind the door.
It's me, Billy.
Jess body checks the door before fleeing downstairs. She rounds the steps, but Billy yanks on her hair, causing her to stumble back into the basement. She bolts the door as he screams and slams into it a few times before retreating. Jess takes a minute to catch her breath and check her surroundings. She hears someone calling from outside. It's Peter. He tells her to open the pod bay doors, Jess. But I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid she can't do that. Peter kicks the window in. Okay, it's winter, dude. And hops into the basement. He encroaches on the cautious Jess, who is still holding the fire poker. The police show up just in time to hear Jess's scream. They storm into the basement to find her lying on the ground, the bloody, battered body of Peter in her lap. Content with a job well done, the police carry the comatose Jess upstairs to her bedroom and discuss Peter's guilt. All shown in an excellent oneer, the detectives leave the room and shut off the lights. The camera dollies down the hall, passing the rooms of Jess's deceased co-eds, passing a picture of the Pi Kappa Sig class menagerie, and finally tilts up to catch Billy, closing the trapdoor to the attic. The final shot of Claire's still undiscovered body cranes out as the sound of a phone ringing fills the winter night air.
This dolly shot took 8 hours to light and had an entire day dedicated to it. Maneuvering the massive Panavision cameras and magazines through these narrow hallways was an impressive feat, though operator Burt Dunk did bash an elbow or two on a few door frames throughout the shoot. After the technicians set up, they took 3 takes and called it a day.
Black Christmas shot in Toronto for 40 days, and Bob Clark had complete creative control. It was released in Canada by Ambassador Film Distributors in October of '74, and by Warner Brothers internationally in December. Worried that audiences would confuse it for a blaxploitation film like Blackula or Black Caesar, Warner changed the title to Silent Night, Evil Night. They also asked Clark to change the ending to be a bit more definitive, as in have Billy be caught or have Peter be the killer in the end, but he refused. Under the new title, the film delivered a lackluster performance, so they quickly changed the title back for the remainder of the distribution. For the soundtrack, composer Carl Zutrair experimented with tying combs and silverware to the tuning forks of his upright piano to get some of the musical effects in the film. His first sound mix had far more high-intensity strings and stabs, but Bob Clark told him to tone it down. In the final product, the soundtrack is very understated, and its ambience is instead provided by sound effects and the occasional musical swell. The film has been remade twice, once in 2006 by Glenn Morgan, and then again, albeit much more loosely, in 2019 by Sofia Takal. While both do have their merits, in my opinion, neither really managed to capture the holiday magic of the original. Writer Roy Moore said that he greatly approved of the film when it was finished. Black Christmas was the last horror movie Bob Clark intended to make, and would soon branch out to more mainstream hits like Porky's and A Christmas Story. He and John Carpenter had been working on a horror movie about a murderous family in the Appalachians, but sadly it never got made. While together, Carpenter asked Clark if he intended to make a sequel to Black Christmas, and what would that look like. Clark said that he didn't intend on making it, but if he had, it would be set the following year in October. The implication would be that the killer was caught, but that he had escaped a mental institution, and would be stalking folks at the same house, and he would call it Halloween. Sound familiar? Now obviously a hypothetical logline does not a screenplay make, and what Carpenter did with the franchise far exceeds what Clark's intentions were. But he always said that he would have liked to see a little more love for the title of the film.
Black Christmas started the holiday movie craze that tore through the 70s and 80s. We had Halloween, Valentine's Day, April Fool's Day, practically any day you can think of. But Bob Clark's interesting characters and his carefully crafted and storyboarded shots have given the Father Christmas of them all an incredible longevity. Have a safe and happy holidays, and until next time, I've been RJ, this has been Killer Canuck, and thanks for watching. Hey folks, RJ here. Thanks for watching this episode of Killer Canuck. Just want to give a huge thanks to the folks here at RUE MORGUE for hosting this series on their channel. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at RealKillerCanuck. If you like the tune playing in the background, be sure to check out Prodigy on SoundCloud and over at noiserecords.com. There'll be a link in the description below. Let me know if there's a Canadian horror film you think I should cover. Have a safe and happy holidays. Until next time.